Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Lunchtime Learning webinar series. We're really excited for today's event. It is on a topic that I think all of us partake in, so it's something that we can all learn something about and how we can lower our impact in it. My name is Brendan Woodruff. I'm the DEC co-lead of the Green New York Council, and I'm excited to have you here today. Just a couple programming notes before we get started. First off, everybody is on mute when you enter the webinar. If you do have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat box. We will be getting them to them at the end. We'll be reading off the questions. So if something does come up, you can just enter it into the chat at any time, and we'll get to the questions at the end. In addition, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be up on the Green New York website afterwards. So if you wanted to go back and see any of the slides again, re-see something, or if you want to send it along to any of your coworkers that maybe couldn't be here today, you'll be able to do that. And again, that's right on the Green New York website. We're also excited that we've recently announced the next 6 months of webinars for the series. We've got sustainable clothing today. We've got sustainable outdoor recreation coming up in December. We have avoiding greenwashing in January, sustainable brewing in March. Then we have electric outdoor lawn equipment in March, and then we also have sustainable summer outdoor recreation in April. So we're really excited about our upcoming series, and you can register for all of those on the Green New York website. So without further ado, let's get into today's presentation. I'm really excited to have Beth Pateni here, who's going to present on sustainable clothing. So take it away.
Hi, Brendan. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be part of this series. Very exciting. I really appreciate your work. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Green Wardrobe Guide, and it basically came out of my work that I had been doing on toxins for many years before that. I run a small nonprofit organization called Green Inside and Out down here on Long Island. And it was kind of a natural extension of realizing that we're starting to eat healthy and eat organic, but most people weren't thinking about the clothing that they're putting on their bodies and what effects that may have on both our health and the environment. So I started to do some more research and unfortunately found out that the fashion industry is considered by the UN Conference on Trade and Development to be the second most polluting industry in the world, and that's after the oil industry. So what is it that's in our clothes? Most people would be surprised to know that there's quite a few chemicals in our clothing. There can be carcinogenic aromatic amines related to some of the dyes. Some of the dyes can be allergens. There can be heavy metals in some of the dyes, including cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, as you see there. Chromium is used in the tanning of leather, for example. Organotins is another set of chemicals. They're used as a textile preservative sometimes. Chlorinated benzenes. Benzene is a carcinogen, and toluene is another toxin to the kidneys and liver and the nervous system. Flame retardants are often used in many textiles, such as polybrominated diethers, and the PFAS, which we may have heard of lately in the news. Formaldehyde is used to make clothing less wrinkle-prone. And phthalates are plasticizers. They're hormone disruptors that are sometimes used even in the ink on T-shirts. So another thing most people don't realize is that polyester is made of plastic. As you can see there in the picture, it's terephthalic acid. Again, that word phthalate because the phthalates are in the plastic. So, you know, polyester has its benefits. You know, we had our polyester pants from the 1970s, and they're still around because it's a very durable product. So in that way, it's great. It, you know, has longevity. But it's also manufactured using antimony, which is a catalyst that causes cancer. And it can be toxic, as you see there, to the lungs and so forth. So it has both its pros and cons. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the alternatives, or are some of the alternatives. So I got into this whole subject of cotton and organic cotton by way of studying pesticides. As many of us are aware, pesticides have numerous health impacts. There's a range of, different diseases that can be associated with certain pesticide use. Some are associated with cancer, such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A few years ago, the World Health Organization came out with a report on Roundup saying that it may be a carcinogen. Certain pesticides are suspected of disrupting the body's hormone system, which, either mimicking or blocking our natural hormones. Some pesticides, like insecticides, can be damaging to the nervous system. So thankfully, we have organizations like the DEC helping to protect us against all of these as a wide range of chemicals. Some are worse than others. But it's so exciting to see the growth of the organic cotton industry because, cotton is a natural product. Obviously, it's made from plants. However, 25% of the world's pesticide use is used on cotton, believe it or not. So organic cotton is grown without pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, just has to be certified just like any other farms would be, like by NOFA and so forth. It's a third-party certification system that's managed by the USDA. And though it's a small percentage of the cotton market, it's definitely growing. Organic cotton now is grown in 18 countries, including here in the USA, in India, Turkey, Peru, China. It's grown on about 1 million acres as of right now, and it's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is really exciting. One large athletic clothing vendor has committed to using over 50% organic or recycled cotton in its products, and even one of the major fast fashion brands is doing the same thing. So it's really interesting to see some of these bigger companies really investing in the use of organic cotton, which is, really encouraging to see, and it's helping to grow the market quite a bit. So it's important to look for the certain label, which is the Global Organic Textile Standard label, or GOTS, as we call it, because that is a much stronger standard that it's not only organic, but it goes all the way down through the supply chain of when you buy an item of clothing. It's throughout their whole manufacturing process from start to finish, which is really great. And it also includes standards for labor, because unfortunately there's no guarantee that even organic cotton isn't being processed in what we would sort of term sweatshop conditions. So if you see the GOTS label, you're sure that that's not the case. And fair trade also, again, very, similar in that it has standards for, worker conditions and sort of takes out the middleman. So hemp is another fiber that we can use. And of course, the question always comes up when I give presentations about this. Can you smoke your skirt? The answer is no. Industrial hemp, or cannabis sativa, contains only about, as you can see, 0.03 to 0.05 of the chemical THC, which is, what gives people a high. So different part of the different type of plant within the same species. Hemp is actually a very hardy plant, just like its name. It grows like a weed. It can be harvested 3 times per year. The fabric is very sturdy, and it kind of has the same feel as linen. Sometimes it's blended with cotton to make it a little softer. And hemp is exciting because it's been grown for at least 12,000 years. Even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both cultivated hemp on their farms. So it, can be used for twine and rope. It was even used for sails. It can be used for shoes, many, many different uses for hemp. And I think probably, Brendan, you would know better than I would, but I know certain types of hemp can be grown in New York State, I believe.
That is correct. Yeah, the state does have an industrial hemp program.
Yeah, it's great. So, because it had been banned in the United States for many years, so things are slightly changing now just because of all these other uses for hemp. But bamboo is another type of plant-based fabric that we can look for. Bamboo is actually a type of grass, and it grows very rapidly. When fabric is made from bamboo cellulose. It's often very soft. They commonly use it for yoga clothing and socks and towels and sheets. But it's really fallen out of favor in some of the eco-fashion circles because a lot of chemicals are used to process the cellulose, including sodium hydroxide, carbon disulfide. So it's not one of the major favorites, but I put it there just as another option because you may see it in the marketplace. Another sustainable fabric that we can look for when we're shopping for clothes is lyocell. The trade brand is Tencel, so you might see that on the label. It's made of eucalyptus trees. And this lyocell is actually pretty exciting because it uses a lot less water than cotton. Cotton is a very thirsty plant. In fact, it's said that 700 gallons of water is used to make just one cotton t-shirt. And I should have mentioned before also with cotton, there's a lot of chemical use there just to make the cotton white and give it a luster. There can be biocides used to prevent rot, fabric softeners, all these chemicals used on typical cotton. So lyocell avoids a lot of that. Modal is another type of cellulosic fiber. This one is made specifically from the cellulose of beech trees. And you can see there in the picture at the bottom, it's like wood, and then it's made into a pulp, and then it's put through these spinnerets to make it into thread. So the fiber becomes a thread that can be used for clothing. And again, there's the question of dyes. A lot of times you might be having a natural fabric with, chemical dyes. So it's all a process of, we're moving, the industry moving in the right direction eventually. So some of the other fabrics that are becoming used are soy, believe it or not. It's a byproduct of the soy, food business. There can be cupro, regenerated from cellulose from cotton waste. Ingeo is actually made from corn biopolymers, believe it or not. C-cell is a type of algae fabric. They're making it from like the fibers in algae. Linen is a very common one. Most people would be familiar with that. It's made from the flax plant. And another thing that you may see in the marketplace is recycled polyester. So, again, this is kind of like a toss-up because we're hearing about the microfibers ending up in waterways, and they're so tiny they can pass through the sewage treatment plant. So they're ending up, finding a lot of these, these polyester bits in the ocean. However, if you're using recycled polyester, the argument there is at least we're keeping the waste out of the landfill for much longer. So there are some, brand names that are using a lot of recycled polyester. So that's the one benefit of that. And we can actually make recycled polyester out of bottles. So it provides a market for the use of recycled bottles. So now I won't linger on this one too long. I know it's gross, but I think it's just, worth people being aware, thinking through of, when we're making purchases, where things come from. So, there's a lot of people becoming vegan these days. The industry does tend to push the meat market, which has carbon impacts on the planet as we're becoming more aware these days. Wool it's sheared from the sheep, but sometimes it's not the kindest method of doing things. Often, sheep are injured in the process. Fur, they use electrodes on the animal's snout and things like that. It's just, I won't gross you out too much, but silk, they use silkworms, and often it means boiling them alive. Down, the feathers are plucked from the duck's chest and belly, as you see there in the picture. So just some things to think about. But in terms of leather, I wanted to mention shoes, because shoes can be really difficult to find eco-friendly. I've had hemp shoes, canvas shoes, but it's kind of exciting. Now there are alternatives like Muskin. It's actually like a leather made from mushroom skin. Pinatex is made from pineapple skin. I've even seen apple skin used to make alternatives for leather. So there are more and more alternatives, which are really exciting. And I always say it's the power of the consumer. It's what we demand. So when I was researching the book, I did some research on some of the high-end brands that you see there that you might see on a runway, because I was hoping to tell the story, well, look, all these brand names are using some of these sustainable fabrics. But unfortunately, I kind of found the opposite. A lot of the high-end brands weren't using the sustainable fabrics that we talked about. Only 14 out of 50 had a sustainability plan. But I definitely think that this is something that's changing. It's very exciting. I'm a member of the New York City Fair Trade Coalition, and a lot of the young, millennials that are at the Fashion Institute of Technology in the city and other fashion schools are really interested in sustainability. They're using a lot of upcycled fabrics. There's actually an organization that in the state of New York that takes back commercial, like on a commercial scale, takes back unused fabrics. Like if a clothing manufacturer orders too many bats of a material, they'll take it and resell it for others to use. And it's, saving material that would otherwise end up in the landfill. So there's a lot of innovation happening as well. It's encouraging. So I wanted to mention this as well, because aside from looking for the proper fabrics, or, more eco-friendly fabrics, I should say, one of the biggest impacts of our clothing is the way that we launder it. So one of the things that we can all do is try to look for eco-friendly bio-based detergents, preferably without fragrance, because fragrance is kind of a code word for chemicals. It can mean a lot of things. Fragrance can also contain phthalates, those hormone disruptors that we talked about before. So it's best to avoid those if possible. There can be these laundry balls I use. They contain these orbs, basically like little ceramic balls that make the water pH level change so that it takes out the dirt out of your clothing and you don't have to use detergent at all. And when it comes to dry cleaning, I know New York State has a big effort on raising awareness on dry cleaning. The Pollution Prevention Institute has worked on this quite a bit. And we can look for more eco-friendly dry cleaners that don't use perchloroethylene, which is a carcinogen that's used by the majority of dry cleaners. Wet cleaning is one option to look for. I know we have a bunch of them down here on Long Island. Green Earth is another, brand of dry cleaning that it's basically a silicone-based solution. So you can look for those in your communities. And also, it's always a matter of just using maybe cool water instead of hot, uses less energy, running the machine when it's full, all those kind of tips. So I also wanted to make us aware that in terms of clothing and, textiles, there's also bedding that's made of textiles. So when we're buying our towels and sheets, we can look for organic cotton or even hemp. There are bamboo towels, like I mentioned. And also we should be aware that a lot of our mattresses and, anything really made of cushions with polyurethane foam may contain the fire retardants, the PBDEs, as mentioned before. Those have been banned mostly in Europe, but they're still in use in the United States. Some of the adhesives may contain ethylene oxide, a probable carcinogen. So just to look for alternatives as much as we can. Like my own mattress is stuffed with organic cotton, and they use bromate as a fire retardant, which is pretty much, inert in terms of human health. But important because we're spending at least, hopefully 7 hours a night sleeping. So in terms of baby stuff, of course, this is really important because children are very susceptible to the toxic effects of chemicals. There can be flame retardants that are used in some pajamas. There's been a rule on the books in the United States for many, many years now, a few decades, that to avoid fire, any loose-fitting pajamas have to contain flame retardants. So it's recommended that if you buy leggings that are tight fitting, they're less likely to contain the flame retardants. It's not required for those. But there can be flame retardants in nursing pillows and cribs and changing pads. So just something to be aware of. Maybe it's something to buy recycled at least. And these chemicals can be associated with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity, hearing problems, and slow mental development. So I include in here also, as part of having an eco-friendly wardrobe, that our cosmetics and body care products are part of it as well. Right now, under U.S. law, cosmetic products do not need FDA approval before they go on the market, and the one exception to this is color additives. So the FDA is able to regulate to a certain extent, but it mostly relies on the manufacturers to do a lot of the testing on safety. So a few years back, the Environmental Working Group, based in Washington, D.C., is a nonprofit organization. They did a study called Skin Deep and found that 1/3 of personal care products contain at least one chemical linked to cancer. So again, something to be aware of. There's the safecosmetics.org. There's a few ingredients to look out for here that I've mentioned. Phthalates, again, they're those hormone disruptors. Parabens, again, they're an antimicrobial preservative, but they're weakly estrogenic, so they can act in concert with our own natural estrogen. Nail polish contains formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen, toluene, and phthalates. But there are many alternatives available, so it's just a matter of being a smart consumer and looking for these things. And EWG put together an app, so you can actually just right on your phone look up how eco-friendly a personal care product is. They have thousands of products in their database. So overall, where does the fashion industry need to go from here? And it is moving in this direction, thankfully. There are many organizations working on that. We need to pay more attention to the environmental impacts of our clothing, how they're produced, as well as the wearer's health, because we have the clothing next to our skin. The garment workers' conditions, of course, very important. And there's a movement towards cradle-to-cradle manufacturing, which is like a circular fashion economy, so to speak, to reduce the waste of resources. We also need more transparency in clothing labels and traceability of how items are handled along the supply chain. So as mentioned, there are a bunch of different organizations that are working on all of these things. Global Organic Textile Standard. In Europe, there's a standard called Ecotex. Again, it's a restricted substances list, like an RSL, in other words, and Blue Sign standard is very similar. The Higg Index, that's something by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which again takes into account the workers' conditions. So things are moving in the right direction, and a lot of these, name brands are seeking to, bear these labels. So where do you find eco-fashions? There's a lot of boutiques that carry eco-fashion. You can find certainly these types of clothing online, and it's not all just for women. There's definitely menswear that's eco-friendly as well. And something I recommend is recycling and buying, in other words, repurposing clothing. So we'll get into that right here, in fact. So if you remember nothing else about everything I just said, here's just kind of like the summary of how to green your wardrobe. First of all, decide if you really need it. I mean, a lot of times we purchase clothing that we may not need, and it ends up getting worn once and then thrown away. So one thing is just decide if you really need it. The second is determine if what you need could be found at a thrift store or a consignment shop or, online sources that resell clothing. There'll be quite a few of those becoming more popular these days. When you do need to seek new clothing, look for natural fabrics that have the least environmental impact, like we discussed earlier. Launder clothing using eco-friendly methods. Instead of tossing salvageable clothing, mend it. Like if it just needs a button, it's something you can sew on. And And of course, this is the important part. Donate clothing in good condition back to a thrift store so it can be reused, because currently 85% of clothing is ending up in landfills. I'm actually working on a white paper on this right now that we hope to put out soon. So I put this in just for fun. Last year, I got to go to the World Fair Trade Summit in Peru, and it was really wonderful. And we got to meet these women here that were using all natural dyes just from the nature around them, using the minerals from the soil, the plants. It was just really an incredible experience. So there are a lot of companies using natural dyes as well, like their, earth tones. So I have some of that clothing in my wardrobe as well. It's really great. Like indigo can be used to make blue. It's beautiful. So I just want to thank the DEC for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beth. That was fantastic, and that was a really good overview. I really liked kind of the summary slide you had there as well at the end. We really like to go with a hierarchy approach with this stuff, and I think you did a really good job kind of explaining, what people can do. So we've got a couple questions here, and if folks have more questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And if you have any tips on what you've done for your wardrobe to make it green, let us know, and we'll get to those questions. So the first one we have here is one that always pops up when we talk about different eco-friendly products, is costs. Are these, is there a price premium for some of these fabrics that are out there, like the organic cotton or the bamboo or the hemp or stuff like that?
Yes, that's a great question. I should have addressed that because it always comes up. So it kind of varies. So organic cotton does tend to be a little more expensive than regular cotton. But of course, it depends where you're buying. If you're looking at Nordstrom, it's probably less expensive. But, compared to Old Navy, yes, it probably is more expensive because the farms have to be certified organic. And, they're doing a lot more, there's a lot more labor involved in avoiding the pests. It's a lot more monitoring and things like that. So that's part of that. But hemp does tend to be expensive because most of it is grown abroad because we haven't been able to grow it here in the United States, though that's changing now. Bamboo tends to be pretty affordable. Tencel, the same. The lyocell is pretty affordable. And the other ones are just, less common. It really depends on, some brands use the fabric and charge quite a bit and others don't. So that's pretty much the summary on that.
That's good to know. Another comment that we saw here was you mentioned some sort of clothing made out of soy. Has anybody used the tagline "tofu to tease" yet?
Not that I've heard of. You might want to get a patent on it.
yeah, somebody's going to run out and trademark that now.
I know. A lot of the soy is genetically modified, so that's an issue, but that's for another lecture some other day.
Everything is intersectional.
Yeah.
So another thing here, and this has come up on a bunch of our other presentations as well, is there's always trade-offs with this stuff. So you mentioned kind of the recycled polyester as being an example of this, where you're putting these into you're using the recycled content, but it might lead to microfibers. There's other things like that. So with all these trade-offs for all of these, what do you personally go with when you're looking for kind of a new fabric or something like that? What do you focus on?
Myself? Well, my first step, like I said in the summary, is I try to look for clothing at the thrift store. And so then if I don't find it at the thrift store, then my first go-to is organic cotton, and I also love the lyocell. So those are the two that I look for the most if I'm buying stuff online and being naughty buying stuff. And actually, like I said, in New York City, of course, there's so many shops that sell, like there's one that actually sells, the clothing is made from fabric that's all from the cutting room floor. So all being recycled. So lots of innovation. So I look for that.
Yep. So what fabrics do you recommend for winter sports other than wool?
That's a good one. Well, I actually have a coat that's made of recycled wool. It's not that common, but you can find it. And I guess, if for winter sports, I would probably just look for the recycled polyester because a lot of those puffy types of jackets contain polyester fill. So some of the major sportswear brands are using a lot of this, recycled polyester. So that's probably the best option other than, if you can look for humane wool. Actually, the Textile Exchange is an organization that has a label for humane wool and humane down. So if you can look for those labels, that's something to check for.
Mm-hmm. So do you have, just off the top of your head here, any kind of places where people can look to get more information regarding chemicals in clothing and issues such as ADHD, hearing problems, things like that you had mentioned before?
Sure. Actually, I'm on the advisory board of a wonderful nonprofit organization called Fashion Forward. It's fashionfwd.org. So their main focus is the chemicals in clothing, and there's quite a few other organizations like them, but they happen to be right here in New York State. So check them out.
Mm-hmm. So are there any web pages that you know of where people can go to search for eco-friendly products and clothing like near me?
Oh, near you. I guess you'd have to do a Google search and see. In my book, I actually listed 200, not that I'm trying to sell the book, not allowed, but in the book I did list, 200 eco fashion stores around the country, and they're state by state. So New York has quite a few, and of course California's way ahead of us. They have tons of eco fashion stores. So a lot of it's online, in the cities, you'll find boutiques that carry these things. So yeah, that's what I recommend.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed someone put there that polyester is made of plastic, which is made of oil. It's a very good point. It's made from fossil fuels that we're wearing, nylon and all that. It's actually not recyclable either. Not latex. Lycra is not recyclable. So that's a problem for the industry.
That's a really good point, and everything on these webinars comes back to climate change. Oil is in everything, more or less, it seems like, when it comes to consumer products, and then you have the emissions from extracting it, refining it into a usable form for either plastics or other things. Another big issue with the apparel industry is the amount of travel that takes place. A lot of this stuff is sourced one place in one country, then it's moved to another to be processed, then it's assembled in another country, then it goes to another one for warehousing, then it goes to another one for final sale and distribution, and then, whether it's recycled or not, the waste could end up somewhere else. So just the amount that this industry kind of moves things around adds to climate change as well. There's a lot of travel emissions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful documentary called The True Cost. If anyone hasn't seen that, it kind of tells that whole story. Very educational. The True Cost. It's all about the fashion industry. It came out a few years ago.
Let's see. I'm just taking a look at some of the more questions here. Yes, this is being recorded, so this will be on the Green New York website afterwards if folks want to see that. That's come in a couple times.
Wow, these are great questions. I see quite a few. And anyone can reach out to me afterwards. You have my email there.
Yep. Could you comment on the sustainability of the linen industry?
That I don't know too much about, but I believe it's fairly sustainable. I haven't heard of flax and linen causing any major environmental damage because it can be used for many things, including omega-3s if you're vegetarian. But again, nothing's perfect. So even if you have linen, sometimes it might have toxic dyes on it. But we do the best we can, and things are moving in the right direction. But I haven't heard any major impacts from flax. So linen is probably a good choice. And, these things are biodegradable as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any information on the reduction of potential chemical content of textiles over time, so things like off-gassing?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. When I researched the book, it was a few years ago, and at that time I couldn't find any like major studies that really tracked the health impacts of the chemicals like absorbing into our skin and the off-gassing. I know off-gassing, for example, is an issue with the perchloroethylene when you dry clean your clothing. It's actually recommended that if you use perc to take the plastic bag off outside, so any of the perc can off-gas to the outdoors rather than into your closet. But there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area. I'm really curious about that myself. Because, sometimes when you bring new clothing home, it has a certain odor to it. You can smell the chemicals.
Yeah, and that also you had mentioned before getting into bedding and linens and stuff like that. That's also kind of a consideration with looking at mattresses and things you're going to spend, sheets and all that. You're going to spend a lot of time into. So
right,
something
right.
to think about for those products as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and over time when you wash things, the chemicals do tend to leach out, of course, but then it's going into our waterways and has to be treated by our sewage treatment plants. So we'll see. In a few decades, we hope things will just keep improving, especially for workers. That's important when you're workers that are working with these fabrics and dyes all the time for their health and their communities. A lot of it is being produced in China and India, but, some of it here in the United States, too.
And so we've had a couple questions here regarding the best thing to do with clothing that can't be mended or repaired instead of throwing it into the landfill. Can you speak a little bit about kind of considerations when it comes to what to donate to, thrift stores versus, textile recovery and things like that?
Yeah, so actually, I actually have a radio show on WUSB if anyone ever wants to listen down here in Stony Brook. So for the radio show, I've been interviewing some people that work in this industry, and The True Cost talks about this also, that documentary I mentioned. So it seems to be that the system is when clothing is donated, it either goes to like a place like Goodwill or, some other organization where it's sorted as to what they think they can sell. And that goes to the thrift store, and anything that can't be sold ends up being sorted into these like big bins, bales, basically, of different types of clothing. And oftentimes they are sent to, if they're really not in good condition, they're used for the rag industry and for insulation purposes, so they get shredded. But otherwise, they end up going often to developing nations where there's like a secondhand clothing industry, believe it or not. So and it's kind of an ethical thing. I've been trying to figure this out. Like if you donate clothing that you want to be used for someone in need, but someone else is reselling it, there's a little bit of an ethical issue there, but nonetheless, it's still keeping the clothing out of the landfill down the line. So it's pretty interesting. It's like a whole secondary industry.
And another thing too that I'd like to thank one of our frequent viewers for pointing out in the comments here is that New York State does have a searchable database for textile recovery locations, and that's through the New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling, or NYSAR 3. So if you search for that, textile recovery locations, they do have a really good resource where you can find places where you can take old textiles and then they'll be processed.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you for pointing that out. That's right. I have heard of them. Yep. There was a campaign I think it was in Westchester or the Hudson Valley area called Reclothe New York, and getting people to, recycle their clothing. And, New York City has some great innovations going on. Like they're trying to keep clothing out of the landfill. So even the sanitation department of the city is involved in like putting bins in multifamily housing to make it easier for people. It's really great. I'd love to see more happening out here in the suburbs where I live.
So when shopping, is country of origin also a concern when you're looking for various types of clothing? And I guess that kind of gets into the question of fair trade and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of is an indication when you see certain countries, like developing countries where most clothing is made, they might not have the best standards, like as high as we have here in the United States. But, even that is changing because there's so much consumer pressure and demand for better conditions for workers because no one wants to feel like they're, paying someone $1 a day to make their T-shirt. In fact, a few years ago, you may have heard in the news, there was a collapse of a building in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. And, several hundred people died, unfortunately. And so it really shone a light on the need for, fair trade, like we were talking about before, just making sure the labor conditions are better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's also considerations with some countries as well when it comes to cotton production. I know the U.S. has a ban on cotton imports from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan because of the use of slave labor in harvesting the cotton. So that's one where, there is a ban on selling cotton from those countries in the U.S., but, just something to look out for as well. So another question here came in about vegan leather and the sustainability of the processing of that. Do you have any information on that compared to kind of the tanning process?
Not too much because it's an emerging industry, so I'm not really sure on that. I'd have to look. I'm sure it's not perfect either. Unfortunately, nothing seems to be in this world, but at least I think it's an improvement over, the animal cruelty thing and the climate change effects of using leather from cows. But again, that's like an ethical issue because a lot of the alternatives to leather are using plastic. And so then you get back into, well, it's made from fossil fuels. And so that has an impact too. So yeah, that's something we need to do more research on. I'm very curious myself.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's very processed, even if you're taking, mushrooms or, apple peels and somehow turning that into something that feels like leather. There's a lot of processing that goes into that. And anytime you have that kind of a processing of an item that much, there's the potential to have a lot of impacts on it.
Right. That's the importance of the transparency. I think a lot of the smaller manufacturers are willing to be more transparent than maybe some of the bigger companies. So it's another consideration.
And one other question here that got into chemicals that are in beauty products. Are there any kind of searchable databases or anything else where folks can learn more about what's in cosmetic products?
Yeah, there's a nonprofit organization called safecosmetics.org. I had that on the slide there. And let me see, can I go back? I'll show you that app from Environmental Working Group. This one, it's called the Healthy Living app, and they have a whole database of products. So you put the product in and it tells you, it gives you a ranking of how, safe/eco-friendly the product is.
And with that, we've got one more comment here that says that this person repurposes old T-shirts and softer fabrics as rags. That's a really good way to, you got something that's non-mendable, you can get kind of a second use out of it. You're doing the reuse right in your own place instead of having to send it out somewhere else to be processed, to be reused as well. So with
great.
that, do you have any final thoughts to leave people with today?
No, I think that's it. I just want to thank everyone for having me. It's really great. And I think the most important thing is just to keep these things in mind that, being a conscious consumer and is doing the best we can and supporting the, the manufacturers that are trying to do the right thing is really great. So moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and thank you so much for presenting today. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to be on the webinar today and for your thoughtful comments and questions. It always adds to the discussion here, and we really enjoy having it. So thanks again, Beth. This was fantastic. If you do want to view a recording of this or share it with someone else, it will be up on the Green New York website soon. And our next webinar is going to be taking place on Tuesday, December 8th, and it is on sustainable winter recreation. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good one.